200 donors in evening wear stood beneath a scale model of a rocket that had never flown, and none of them noticed the toolbox until Whitney Kingsley pointed at it. A NASA delegation is already in the parking lot, asking security for a man in a gray work jacket, and no one at Kingsley Orbital knows why. "This," Whitney said, tapping the battered steel case with one manicured finger, "is what passes for cutting-edge hardware around here tonight." Laughter rippled through the crowd, champagne glasses tilting toward the object like an exhibit. The lid was scratched down to bare metal in places, a brass plate on the front hand-stamped with letters gone soft at the edges. EB, Stage 2. Someone near the back asked if it was a prop. Whitney said she wished it were, that the man who owned it was somewhere in her hangar right now, and that optics being what they were, she'd have a word with facilities about who let contracted labor bring their garage sale into a 9-figure demonstration. She got her laugh. She always got her laugh. What she did not get, 40 minutes later, standing at the hangar's side door with a security radio crackling against her palm, was an explanation. The voice on the other end was flat and procedural, the way voices get when the person speaking hasn't yet decided how alarmed to be. There was a black SUV at the gate, federal plates, and a woman in a NASA windbreaker asking by name for a man in a gray jacket who worked propulsion valves with his hands instead of a diagnostic rig. She had a stamp code. She wanted him brought to the hangar floor immediately, and she wanted the motor left exactly as it was. Whitney looked back through the glass at the crowd still murmuring over her joke, still smiling with champagne-warm faces, and for the first time, all evening felt the ground somewhere beneath her account of the situation, not under her feet, shift half an inch to the left. Stay with this one to the end. The toolbox isn't the part of this story that matters most. 6 weeks earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday that looked like every other Tuesday, Edmund Boone stood at the stove, in a one-bedroom apartment outside Huntsville, stirring oatmeal on a low flame, while his son laced his shoes at the kitchen table, left foot first, always left first. Frankie Boone was 9 years old, narrow-shouldered, quiet in the particular way of children who have learned to watch a parent's face for information the parent won't offer directly. He packed his own lunch most mornings now, a turkey sandwich, an apple cut into 6 pieces because 5 felt uneven to him and 7 felt greedy, and set it beside the toolbox that lived under the coat rack by the door, the way another family might keep an umbrella stand. The toolbox went nowhere Edmund didn't go. It had ridden in the passenger seat of 3 different trucks, sat under 2 different beds, and now rested each night against the wall of an apartment that smelled faintly of solvent. No amount of laundry soap ever fully lifted from his jacket cuffs. Its lid, when opened, showed a corkboard glued to the underside, and pinned to the corkboard was a photograph gone soft-cornered and cracked down one edge. Diane, 26 years old, laughing at something outside the frame, an avionics badge clipped crooked to her collar. Beneath the tray insert, folded twice, was a page torn from an old logbook in her handwriting. Edmund did not read it every morning. He read it most mornings, which was different and important to him in a way he never explained to anyone, including himself. He drove Frankie to school and then drove himself to Pruitt's Salvage and Machine, where he changed hydraulic seals and rebuilt starter motors for farm equipment that had outlived its warranties by a decade, wearing coveralls with the shop's name stitched crooked above the pocket, because Silas Pruitt had done the stitching himself, badly, and refused to have it redone. Silas was 61, a retired propulsion technician who had worked beside Edmund 14 years earlier at Aldington Aerospace, back when Edmund's name still appeared on drawings before someone decided it shouldn't. The company that had erased it no longer existed under that name. It had been absorbed, restructured, folded into other letterhead, the way small dishonesties get folded into larger ones, until no single person can be blamed for any of it. Edmund had not fought the erasure. He had looked at what fighting would cost, hearings, lawyers, a company with more patience for delay than he had for anger, and he had looked at a 5-year-old boy who had just lost his mother, and he had chosen the boy. Nobody had ever thanked him for that choice. He had never asked anyone to. The gala invitation came to Pruitt's Salvage by fax, addressed not to Edmund, but to on-call propulsion support, because a company 2 rungs above him on paper had one motor, one night, and nobody left on staff who could make it behave. The man who met Edmund at Kingsley Orbital's loading gate did not offer a handshake. Sheldon Winthrop was 40 years old, Kingsley Orbital's lead propulsion engineer, and he looked at Edmund's coveralls, at the toolbox handle worn pale where 4 decades of hands had gripped it, and made a decision about Edmund's competence before either of them had said a full sentence. "You're the contractor," he said, not quite a question. "The abort motor's stuttering on its feed cycle, intermittent, hasn't thrown a clean fault code in 6 runs. Diagnostic rig says nominal. It is not nominal." He said this the way a man recites a complaint he has already made to 3 other people who didn't listen either. Whitney Kingsley arrived on the hangar floor, trailing 2 board members and the particular brightness of someone who has rehearsed being gracious to strangers for exactly as long as strangers remain useful. She was 47, precise in the way inherited money is often precise, having taken controlling shares in her father's fund 3 years earlier, and never quite convinced herself the company was hers rather than his. She glanced at Edmund once, at the jacket, at the toolbox he set down without ceremony beside the motor housing, and something in her face closed like a door in a house where the owner has decided a visitor doesn't merit the good room. "This is our propulsion support," Sheldon said. "Is it?" Whitney said, already looking past him toward the donors filing in for the evening's early tour. "Well, fix what you can before 7. We have people coming through who paid for the privilege of believing this company builds miracles." She said it lightly, the way people say things they intend to repeat later as a joke, and when she repeated it 40 minutes afterward to a knot of donors gathered near the motor stand, gesturing at the toolbox with 2 fingers, the way she might gesture at a stray dog that had wandered onto a golf course, the room laughed on cue, and Edmund did not look up from the housing he was already palming for heat. Sheldon didn't defend him. Sheldon was busy not being wrong in front of his CEO, which took most of a propulsion engineer's available attention on a night like this one, and so nobody in that hangar was watching Edmund closely enough to see what he was actually doing, which was the only mistake in the room that mattered. He did not touch the housing to make an impression. He touched it because that was how he had always begun, going back to a training bay at Aldington Aerospace 14 years earlier, and no title anyone had stripped from him had ever managed to strip that habit loose. He closed his eyes half a second before his palm made contact, an old reflex, as though the motor deserved the same courtesy you'd extend a person before you touched their shoulder. Around him, the laughter thinned into conversation, the donors drifting toward canapes, Whitney already turning to greet someone with a larger checkbook, and none of it reached him, because he was listening to something with a frequency too fine for the room to notice it was even making a sound. The first feed cycle told him only that something was wrong. The second told him where. By the third, his hand resting flat against warm alloy while the pump cycled beneath his palm in its long, patient rhythm, he could feel it. Not a fault, not a failure exactly, but a stutter, a half-beat hesitation every 40 seconds, the valve seating a fraction late each time, as though it were arguing with itself before it agreed to close. The diagnostic rig, wired into 6 sensor points around the housing, registered nothing. It measured pressure and temperature and flow rate in numbers precise to 4 decimal places, and none of those numbers could feel what a hand could feel, which was intention, the difference between a part behaving as designed and a part behaving as something else entirely had quietly decided it should. Near the hangar door, unnoticed by the donors and by Whitney and by Sheldon, who was now anxiously refreshing a tablet screen that told him everything except the truth, Silas Pruitt stood with his arms folded and his old friends back to him, saying nothing at all. Silas had known Edmund 14 years. He recognized the stillness in those shoulders, the way a man recognizes weather coming before the sky has changed color, and he had learned, a long time ago, not to interrupt it. Edmund's fingers found the valve body at the 3rd cycle's end and stayed there. Somewhere behind him, Whitney's laughter carried again, bright and unbothered, entirely unaware that the man she had turned into tonight's entertainment had just located, by feel alone, a defect that 6 sensors and $250,000 of instrumentation had failed to register even once. He did not announce it. He asked Sheldon, without raising his voice, whether the valve batch on this unit had been changed recently, and whether anyone had the batch records handy, because the seating delay wasn't random. It was consistent, which meant it was mechanical, which meant it was traceable. Sheldon's answer arrived a half-second too slow to sound confident, and that half-second was the first thing all evening that told Edmund he might be standing closer to an answer than anyone in the room wanted him to be. He worked the housing loose with a wrench from his own toolbox rather than the tool crib Sheldon offered him, because he trusted the weight of a handle he'd owned for 2 decades more than he trusted borrowed steel, and inside, seated where the feed valve met the manifold, he found it, a batch stamp worn nearly flat, but not flat enough. Different tolerance class than the rest of the assembly. Machined a hair narrow, just enough that under load the seal hesitated instead of closing clean. A defect too small for any rig calibrated to expect the correct part to notice, because the rig had never been told to look for a part that shouldn't be there at all. He reseated the valve by hand, adjusted the feed timing by ear against the rhythm only his palm had ever measured, and ran the cycle a 4th time. The stutter did not return. The motor settled into a long, even breath, the kind of sound Edmund had spent half his life listening for, and had almost forgotten how good it felt to hear answered correctly. It was in that quiet, with the donors starting to notice something had changed in the room's attention, even if they couldn't say what, that the side door opened and Dr. Sylvia Beaumont walked in, flanked by 2 aides in NASA windbreakers, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who has never once needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. She was 55, a certification liaison who had spent 3 decades reading hardware the way other people read faces, and she crossed the hangar floor, not toward Whitney, not toward Sheldon, but toward the open housing, where a hand-stamped code sat exposed under the work light, 2 letters, a dash, 2 words, EB, Stage 2. She stopped. She looked at it the way a person looks at a name they had assumed belonged only to the dead. "I certified a program with this stamp 14 years ago," she said, "to no one in particular, and to everyone at once, under a name that was never on a single piece of paperwork I signed." She turned, and her eyes found Edmund. Jacket, coveralls, a toolbox at his feet with a brass plate, stamped in the exact same hand. "I need to speak with whoever made this mark," she said. "By name, if someone in this room can tell me it." The room, which had spent the whole evening finding Edmund invisible, discovered all at once that it had no idea who he was. The board's emergency session convened the following morning, and the language in it was the sanitized language of institutions protecting themselves: irregularity, discrepancy, deviation from specification. What it meant, stripped of the softening, was that the valve batch Edmund had found wasn't a manufacturing accident. Cross-referenced against procurement records, the narrow tolerance stock had been ordered deliberately, substituted into 3 abort motor assemblies over the past 8 months, each one scheduled for the same recertification cycle, now sitting 11 days from a signing ceremony that would put Kingsley Orbital's abort motor on a crewed capsule for the first time in the company's history. Roderick Aldington, the company's chief operating officer, sat at the head of the table during that session with the particular calm of a man rehearsing his own innocence in advance. He had come to Kingsley Orbital 3 years earlier from an aerospace conglomerate that had once, under a different name, employed Edmund Boone, a fact he did not mention and that no one in the room yet knew to ask about. He proposed, in the reasonable tone reserved for terrible ideas dressed as prudence, that the substitution be attributed to an outside supplier's quality lapse, that a rushed retest be run before NASA's delegation returned, and that the whole matter be resolved quietly, on the company's own schedule, before the signing deadline made silence impossible. Sheldon Winthrop, still holding the tablet that had told him everything except the truth the night before, asked which supplier. Roderick said he'd have the paperwork by afternoon. He did not have it by afternoon. He rescheduled the audit instead, the way a man reschedules a dentist appointment he has no intention of keeping, and did it again 3 days later when Sheldon asked a second time. Whitney, meanwhile, was fielding calls from board members who used the word optics so often it had begun to sound like a diagnosis. A trade reporter had already run 4 paragraphs under the headline, NASA asks for mechanic by name at Kingsley Gala, and the board's private read of the situation was blunt. Either the company controlled the story by quietly separating itself from Edmund Boone a second time, framing him as contracted labor whose usefulness had ended with the demonstration, or it risked looking like a firm that had built its flagship program on a foundation it didn't understand and couldn't defend. Whitney found herself in the strange position of being asked to repeat, formally and in writing, the exact dismissal she had delivered as a joke 11 days earlier. Except this time, the joke had grown teeth, and somewhere behind her own resolve, quietly, she was no longer certain the man in the gray jacket was the one who deserved to be afraid of what came next. Silas Pruitt arrived at the Kingsley Orbital campus on the 9th day, carrying a banker's box that had lived in his garage attic for 14 years, the cardboard gone soft at the corners, and set it on the conference table without asking anyone's permission to speak. Inside were time-stamped design logs from the original Aldington Aerospace abort motor program, drafts, revision histories, calibration notes, all of them bearing, in the corner of every page, the same hand-stamped initials that now sat inside a housing 11 days from certification. "I kept these," Silas said, "because I figured someday somebody'd ask the right question instead of the easy one." The room's silence at that moment was its own kind of testimony. Nobody there had a document to set beside it. That reversal alone might have closed the matter, if the matter had only been about a stolen credit 14 years gone. It was Sheldon, 2 days later, working alone at his desk past midnight because some part of him had stopped trusting Roderick's rescheduled audits, who found the second one. He had pulled the new batch numbers from the substituted valves and, out of a stubbornness he couldn't fully explain even to himself, cross-referenced them against every procurement signature on file, rather than just the current suppliers. The match, when it came, was not ambiguous. The same defective tolerance class, ordered through the same supplier's parent company under a different name, had been approved once before, 14 years earlier, at Aldington Aerospace, signed off by a procurement director whose name Sheldon had to search company archives to place, because it predated his own hiring by a decade. Roderick Aldington. The supplier had paid him a fee both times, structured as a consulting retainer the first time and a board advisory stipend the second, and in both cases, the defect had been discovered by the same man, using nothing but a bare hand against warm metal, and in both cases, the company involved had responded first by trying to make him disappear. Sheldon printed both signatures side by side and did not sleep that night. In the morning, he brought them to Whitney's office himself, before Roderick could reschedule anything else. The boardroom on the 11th day held more people than its chairs, so several stood along the back wall, among them Dr. Sylvia Beaumont, arms folded, watching with the stillness of a woman who has sat through a great many corporate reckonings and learned to recognize which ones are genuine. Roderick Aldington's chair, near the head of the table, was conspicuously empty. He had been placed on administrative leave that morning, the matter handed to outside counsel and a federal procurement inquiry, procedural and unglamorous, the kind of consequence that happens mostly in rooms nobody films. Whitney Kingsley stood at the head of the table instead, without notes, which seemed to cost her something. 14 years ago, she said, this company's predecessor took credit for work it didn't do, from a man it then let walk away, rather than correct the record. 11 days ago, I stood in that hangar and made his toolbox a punchline in front of donors because it was easier to see a jacket than a signature. She paused, and the pause was not performance. It had the shape of a sentence she'd rehearsed and then abandoned in favor of a plainer one. I was wrong about what mattered in that room. I am sorry, Mr. Boone. Not for the optics of it, for the fact of it. Edmund sat with his hands loosely folded on the table, the toolbox on the floor beside his chair, and did not look at the room when he answered, only at the space just past Whitney's shoulder, the way a man looks when he is choosing his words from somewhere further back than the present conversation. The board had already proposed, through counsel, reinstating his design credit formally and offering a salaried consulting position with back pay calculated, absurdly, to the day. He let the offer sit a moment before he set it down. I don't need my name on the drawing, he said. I never did. I needed it to be true, and it was true whether anyone wrote it down or not. He let that stand a moment, the room silent around it, and then he said what he'd actually come to ask for. What I'd like is for the company to fund an apprenticeship line. Technicians, not engineers on paper, the kind of people who find things with their hands before a rig ever tells them to look. Name it for my wife. She was an avionics inspector before she got sick. She used to write things in the margins of logbooks that nobody but me ever read. He did not read the margin note aloud to the room. He had it by memory, had carried it in his own hand for years before he ever needed anyone else to hear it, and in the stillness that followed his request, with Dr. Beaumont's eyes steady on him and Whitney's face doing something between grief and relief, he said it only to himself, under his breath, the way a man says a thing he has said every working morning of his life, and does not intend to stop saying now that someone finally knows to listen. Build it so it works when no one's watching. Diane had written it in the margin the week she got sick, and he still checked that page before he checked his own signature, on every job, in every hangar, whether the room was full of donors or empty of everyone but him. The board approved the apprenticeship fund unanimously, 12 minutes later, without a second vote required. 3 months after that, on a spring morning bright enough to lay a clean line of sun across the kitchen table, Edmund packed a lunch the way he always had: turkey sandwich, an apple cut into 6 pieces, except this one wasn't for Frankie. It was for himself, for the first day of a program that didn't exist, 11 days before a gala nobody at Kingsley Orbital had expected to end the way it did. Frankie sat at the table in his socks, one foot tucked under him, watching his father work with the same unhurried attention Edmund had once turned on a stalling motor. The toolbox sat closed on the table between them, its lid catching the light along the worn brass plate, and Frankie reached over and traced the stamped letters with one finger, slow, the way he'd done 100 mornings before this one, without either of them ever remarking on it. "Is this the one that started it?" Frankie asked, not really a question, or the one that finished it. Edmund looked at the plate a moment, then at his son, and folded the wax paper down over the sandwich with the same care he'd once used on a valve seal. "Neither," he said. "It's just the one that was always there." He picked up the toolbox in one hand and the lunch in the other, and at the door, the way he had every working morning for as long as Frankie could remember, he knocked twice against the frame before he opened it, never 3, and stepped out into a morning that had, at last, quietly caught up to the truth. If you believe the quiet ones are usually the ones who built everything, you already know why NASA came looking for a mechanic in a salvage yard.